Well, welcome to this week's episode of Right Talk Wednesday. I am here with Evert Hopman, and she is the author of a number of books on herbalism and Celtic lore and has been a teacher of herbalism since 1983 and Druidism since 1990. She's done a lot of things. She has presented the weekly herb report for WRSI Radio out of Greenfield, Massachusetts for over a year, was featured in a documentary about Druids on A&E Television's The Unexplained, and is a master herbalist and lay homeopath who holds a master's of education and mental health counseling. She's also worked with several Druidic organizations, and she has written and spoken about herbalism and Druidism for a very long time, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Is there anything, I know there was a lot of information there in the biography that will, of course, be posted on our website in the show notes, but is there anything that you would like to add before we kind of dive in?
Um, just that I was Archdruid of Tribe of the Oak until fairly recently, tribeoftheoak.org. And if anyone's interested in studying Druidism, they can go there. We have a new Archdruid, which I'm very happy about. Um, and we're also on Facebook and we have a website. But if you like Celtic Reconstructionist Druidism, which I'm sure we'll talk about, um, check out tribeoftheoak.org.
Wonderful. And I'll make sure that that link's in the show notes as well. So let's begin there. I know this is a big question, but in general, what is Celtic Reconstruction Druidism?
Well, there's many different kinds of Druidism, many different flavors, going back to the 1700s when the Druid revival, the modern Druid revival began with Masons. They were all men and they were all Masons. So they were very, patriarchal, male-oriented. There weren't many women. And then there are still a few British orders, not many, that are direct descendants of that Masonic Druid tradition. There are Irish Druid groups now. There are English Druid groups. There are American Druid groups. And then there's also, most people are kind of lay Druids, solitary. So you'll find people saying that Druidism is nothing but a philosophy. There's some people that say that. There are other people that say if you love trees, that makes you a Druid. But a Celtic Reconstructionist is somebody who cares about archaeology, linguistics, history. And we like to look at the old stories. There's quite a lot of information. There's a big misconception among pagans, especially pagan Druids, that there's no information, therefore you can just make up whatever you want. It doesn't matter. But there's actually quite a lot of information. For example, all the law books, well, we can get into that. But that's actually why I wrote the book Celtic Druidry, so I'll bring it up now. Oh, does that look backwards?
No, that's great. That's
Okay.
perfect.
Celtic Druidry, Rituals, Techniques, and Magical Practices. What I do in this book is I introduce the various concepts, and then I list places where you can go to find out more. So, for example, we have law books that talk about the ancient society, 6th, 7th century, what it was like. We have wisdom tales, we have poetry from the period. This is the really old stuff, because the older you get, the closer you are to the source. That's the way we look at it. So when we find something old, that's what we get excited about. So there are traditions of Wicca and witchcraft and so on where people, and they're very poetic traditions, but they make things up. They say, oh yeah, we're having a ritual next week. Who's going to write the ritual? And then they make it up, which can be very artistic and so on. But for us, what we really enjoy is the old stuff. And Tribe of the Oak is very Irish oriented, and we've always been that way. We have a long history, but that's been our major focus. And that's because there's a lot of literature that goes back. And that's what we look at.
That's a great explanation. And I'm so glad you mentioned about finding the older sources and that there's information out there. I think, but prior to us recording here, I was talking about, I'm a graduate student, and I think that's what kind of opened my eyes because, you know, I'm focused on like religion and culture and then Eastern religions and realizing that we really do have access to a lot of very old information that
Mhm.
is out there if you know where to look for it. And so I'm so glad you mentioned the book that tells people where to go because sometimes I think that's the hardest part is knowing where to look. And I suspect a group um, like yours is a great place for people to begin because then you have guides to help you know where to look.
Yeah, if you go to our website, tribeoftheoak.org, or if you go to my website, elleneverthopman.com, I have the list of all our basic books there, both of those sites. So you don't even have to join the order. You can just read the books. Hopefully you'll be inspired.
That's great. So how did I've talked to several different pagan authors for this series of the podcast, and a lot of people got into writing about spiritual topics because of their own interest. And it sounds like that may be the same for you, but tell us how you got started writing on these topics.
Well, that's a story. But yeah, I was in graduate school and I was working my way through college actually. And I was working in the library at the University of Massachusetts, shelving books. And a lot of books about trees kept floating in front of me. Um, and also I had recently moved to Massachusetts and from Philadelphia. Philadelphia is south of here. So I was used to a growing season that went all the way until December and that started again in March. But here in Massachusetts, although global warming is changing things a bit, but you couldn't really plant anything till after Memorial Day. And by mid-September, you could have frost. So I looked at that and when I moved up here and I said, how on earth did people live? I couldn't figure it out. And I was thinking of the Native Americans and the people that had been here for thousands of years. Like, how do you live when there's no green? There's no greenery, no salad, all year, practically all year, except for 3 months. How's that possible? So then I looked out the window and I saw trees and I said, must have something to do with the trees. And I was just, I was working on my master's in mental health counseling and nothing to do with trees or biology or anything. So, this was before the internet, so I couldn't Google things. There was nothing to Google. Um, so first I went to Barnes and Noble and I looked on the shelf for a book for books about trees. There was nothing. And particularly, there was nothing about how to eat trees. There's nothing like that. So then I went to the science library on campus and went there. They had nothing. The only thing they had was you could look up really, in-depth articles about maybe one plant, something like that. There just wasn't anything. And so these books about trees kept floating in front of me as I was shelving. And so I would open them up. And then I had the idea. I said, well, gosh, I guess if there's no book, I guess I have to write it. But I was already, a very spiritual person. I had been for a long time, and that's another long story. Um, but I was already a pagan. I was already a druid at that point. So I mixed it all together. And the first book was called Tree Medicine, Tree Magic, which is still in print, but it's now revised, expanded, has full color pictures and so on. At that time, it was black and white. But that was my first book, and I wrote it in my spare time in graduate school. So you know exactly how crazy that was. It was pretty nuts when you look back on it. But I, I submitted to a bunch of publishers and most of them wanted it. So, and then as far as I'm aware, that was the first spiritual book about trees. After that, it was just boom, 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 one after the other. Everybody and their brother has written a book about trees, but that was the first one. And that was I was writing that in the early 80s. It came out in the mid 80s.
Wow, that's great. And that echoes a lot of what I'm hearing from other authors, in that there's nothing out there that were looking for, and so you decided to write it yourself. And it sounds like that is a common theme. And I would argue that it's a common theme not just in nonfiction spiritual writing, but a lot of times fiction writing. A lot of us who write fiction started writing the stories that we weren't finding on the shelves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, my brain hiccuped for a moment. The something I found interesting too in what you were saying is talking about the many different flavors of Druidism. And that was something when I was reading information, I was like, well, I was aware that there were a lot of different flavors of Druidism, and you've worked with a lot of different organizations. Do you find that like your writing has changed over the years, or that the way you've thought about things has changed because of working with so many different organizations?
Well, over the years, obviously, I've been studying, Celtic history and literature and poetry and all that. I mean, as the years go by, I'm hopefully a little better versed in that stuff. So, there has definitely been a change. I mean, one of my most popular books is called A Druid's Herbal for the Sacred Earth Year, and that came out in the 80s. And people are, that's probably my bestseller, But in that book, for example, for each of the festivals, I have a goddess and a god. And that's very Wiccan. That is not Celtic. The Celts were polytheists, they didn't pair a goddess and a god. But at that time, I was very heavily influenced by the Henge of Keltria, which was founded by people who were very heavily Wiccan before they became Druid. But I didn't know any better, So yeah, so you learn as time goes on, and it's kind of unfair to look at a book. I mean, for example, this one, Celtic Druidry, this is kind of the way I'm thinking now. If you want to know what I think now, because people still complain about my books, they say, "Oh, that still sounds like Wicca." Well, it was written in the 80s. I mean, things change.
Definitely. And that's a great point to bring up too, because in this internet age, a lot of times it's very hard to vet sources like that. And so people will pick up something. I became introduced to Wicca and paganism in the early 90s. And so um, you know, pick up, I'm thinking of the early books that I picked up, and they're kind of cringe now, but at the time, we all thought they were the most wonderful thing in the world.
Right.
Um, do you have any advice besides obviously picking up your books, Celtic Druidry there that you show? Do you have any advice for people that are just trying to find some good information online about this subject?
Well, as I mentioned, if you go to tribeoftheoak.org or elleneverthopman.com, you will see lists of books. And we've had a basic book list since the 90s, but what I did was a couple of years ago, I consulted somebody in Ireland who was getting their PhD in Celtic studies. And I said, "Hey, would you please just look at our book list and make recommendations?" And they added new books that I didn't know about. And so again, that reading list has been updated. So it's an ongoing work. There's there's always more. Um, But if you're seriously into Celtic Reconstructionist Druidism or CR Druidism, you really need to cast a wide net. You need to study art history, archaeology, linguistics to the best of your ability. It's good to have a Celtic language if you can. Um, scholarship. We're really into scholarship. It's not, I hear people say, oh, just go out and hug a tree and that makes you a druid, and that's not the way we look at it. Being in nature is very important. Being in nature is that's where all the inspiration comes and all the comfort comes and the healing comes. It's all there. But that's only half the picture. You can't say, I'm going to go out and hug a tree and be a druid, because the druids were the intellectual class. They were the Brahmins of the Celtic culture, and they took at least 20 years to train. So to say that you're just going to walk outside and be a druid is kind of insulting. That's why we look at it. It's kind of insulting to the druids who were actual people, you know.
No, that's a wonderful point. That's a great point because um kind of my interest and what I'm hoping to do is really do some academic research into areas that maybe haven't been looked at before as far as like pagan polytheism and some different theology. So yeah, I think it's important that while anybody is welcome to engage on spirituality at whatever level they feel comfortable with, there are certain actions or certain passages that would help people to become more well versed in what they're doing, and I think deepen their spirituality as well. I know myself, the research I've done, even though it's been completely, I thought, unrelated to my personal spirituality, has only served to help deepen my connection to the gods.
Hmm. Yeah. Especially when you see, statues and artwork and things that were created by the ancients, and you realize this is a real thing, it's not just an idea, floating around. I love it when we find new evidence, you know, whether it's finding a temple on Orkney or the Celtic jewelry is incredible. And, um, you know, that we like that.
And this is something that I think people don't understand is still being discovered. Every once in a while, I'm blessed to have some really interesting Facebook friends, and so I'll see different things cross my feed and that, and they're still making new discoveries about the Celts, even now.
Hmm. Yeah, there's currently three theories about where Celtic culture started, for example, and it's something. I mean, I have a list called Celtic and Ancient History, Archaeology, and Art. I think that's what it's called. But I have, I think, over 8,000 members. It's on Facebook. And we have some incredible scholars on there, and we have a lot of lay people on there. And one of the things that perennially gets discussed is, where did Celtic culture come from? And a lot of people say, oh, they automatically say it began in the Hallstatt era in Austria. That's what everybody says. But that's an old idea. There's actually three theories now, and we don't know which one is correct. It's all still being debated. But one possibility is the Hallstatt area of Austria. I was born in Austria, by the way, um, in Salzburg. But that's one idea, and because the Danube River goes through there. And so wherever you have a major river, you have a lot of trade. And where you have trade, you have a lot of exchange of ideas. Languages get traded. Traders have to know multiple languages so they can trade with each other. New goods come in, ideas ferment, things like that. And plus there was a lot of salt in that area. That's why it's called Salzburg. Um, and that made people very rich. In those days, salt was like oil is now, people couldn't live without salt. It was very important. So much so that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. They were worth their salt. But so that's Austria. That's one idea. So that's Celtic from the west. So the idea is that with all that trade going on in the Danube area, that the ideas, the religions, the languages moved up the Danube River and went from west to east. Well, guess what? There's a whole other idea that it began in Spain. So if you think of Spain on the west coast, which is Portugal, basically, Iberia, I should say, not Spain, Iberia. The west coast is along the Atlantic. So you had everybody was going up and down that coast. You had the Phoenicians, Romans, Greeks, you name it. Everybody and their brother was going up and down that coast. So it's the same idea. Once again, you had trade going on from the Mediterranean, going up the coast of Spain, up to Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, but they all had to go up the coast of Spain or Iberia, sorry, bringing languages, bringing trade goods, and some of the oldest, and again, this is all being fiercely debated, but it looks like some of the oldest Celtic inscriptions have been found in Iberia. So predating Hallstatt. So what do you do with that? So, and there's a lot of Celtic names in towns in Portugal and Spain. Anyway, so there's plenty of evidence of the Celts there. And then there's a third theory, which is Celtic from the center, which is Gaul, which is what we call France now. But again, Marseille, which is right on the Mediterranean, which is the west coast of Gaul. Again, an incredible trading center, lots of languages, lots of trade goods, lots of people, different cultures. Everybody had to go to Marseille. And then from Gaul, they would disperse, to Iberia, to Austria, to Britain, they would go from there. So again, that's another idea. Maybe it started there. And that's just an ongoing debate. We don't know.
And it's a fascinating one because they're probably finding, little pieces of evidence here and there.
Yeah, there's evidence turning. And then there's people, of course, mostly in England, who say the Celts never existed. That's a great one. They don't like the Celts because the Irish are the only Celtic nation or the only Celtic people that managed to throw off the English. So they don't like the Irish very much to this day. Anyway.
No, that's all fascinating. I do want to make sure that we talked about a couple of your books. Is Celtic Druidry your recent release, or is there another book that you'd like to mention to us?
Well, Celtic Druidry came out in May of this year, so just a few months ago. But there is, well, I mentioned Tree Medicine, Tree Magic. This is what it looks like now. It originally had a yellow cover. This was my first book that I wrote while I was in graduate school in my spare time. But there is one, where is it? Since this video you said is coming out later in the year?
Yes.
Right. So this book I think might be relevant. This came out last year, so it's still relatively new. Sacred Herbs of Yule and Christmas. And it's remedies, recipes, magic, and brews for the winter season. There's a lot of recipes in there. When I give a recipe, I list all the magical properties of the ingredients. There's a lot of brews, drinks. Again, I list all the magical properties and I give little ideas for chants that you can chant while you make the brew, And I taught many different cultures, animals, spirits, a lot about spirits. I learned when I was writing this, you write a book because you're, like you said, you're interested in a topic. I had no idea, for example, that werewolves were very active at Yule.
I didn't either.
Yeah, that's one of their most active times. So then I was doing a radio interview talking about this book last year when it first came out. and I was being interviewed by a rabbi, and, and we started talking. He said werewolves, and then he started telling me about his family came from Eastern Europe, and so they had a lot of werewolf traditions. And he said, Ellen, do you know how to repel a werewolf? And I was like, well, I was, and this is not in the book because I didn't know it when I wrote the book. But apparently in Eastern Europe, what you do is you collect ashes from the fireplace, and on Christmas Eve, it's really important to do this. You have to throw the ashes out the front door, and that will stop the werewolf. Which when I hear things like that, I always think about it. I muse on it, like, what is that? Okay, fire. It's protection by fire. And
Mm-hmm.
they, probably originally they would have thrown out embers, probably would have been snow on the ground, so it's not an issue. Burning embers, in Scottish tradition, seining, you can walk around the boundaries of your territory, or you can carry a torch, or you could carry lit coals, um, have a shovel and have lit coals and walk around the house 3 times, if you want to protect the house or the barn, but it's purification by fire. So that's what I was thinking. This must be an old folk memory of purification by fire. What is the werewolf? It's the things that scare you, the dark forces in the dark time of year. So you fling out the embers and you overcome the darkness with the fire. That's what I put together. But again, that's not in the book. But I do talk about werewolves in the book, Sacred Herbs of Yule and Christmas. And I talk about many different spirits, things that come up from underground, things that fly through the sky, you know.
Sounds really interesting. I know I just happened to see online, somebody mentioned, and it makes perfect sense to me, the pumpkin spice that we all, well, some of us enjoy in the fall anyway.
Mhm.
I'm a big pumpkin spice fan, but those herbs, the nutmeg, the spices that go into that quite a bit are like protection and prosperity spices, cinnamon. And again, it just made me think like cinnamon to me is associated with fire.
Mhm.
And so it's like it all ties together. It's just little pieces and it's putting those pieces together to make them work for you.
And then medicinally, they're also warming to the body. So ginger,
Hmm.
cinnamon, they're going to actually help you stay warm as the cold sets in.
Hmm. Well, that's wonderful. And um, d I've got all your links and I'm going to put them all in the show notes. But please, I know you've mentioned your site and the temple as well, but are there any other links that you'd like to share with our listeners or viewers, or just want to go ahead and give your website one more time for them?
Okay, my site is elleneverthopman.com, and you'll see all my books there. And if you want books, make nice Christmas presents or Yule presents. So if you want a signed book, that would be a nice gift. If you live in the United States, I will mail it to you with a personal note. You just have to tell me who you want it inscribed to, and I'll sign it to them. But if you don't live in the United States, I've kind of given up on mailing books abroad. It's just way too expensive. So I even have a note about that, but you'll see all my books there. Um, and then again, if you want to study Druidism, tribeoftheoak.org, um, come see us. We're here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here on Right Talk Wednesday. I really appreciate it. I've had a lovely time, having a conversation with you about this. And, I hope when you have a new book out, you'll come back and tell us all about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.